Hey there, and welcome to the Metanoia podcast. My name is Reverend Brandan Robertson. The Greek word metanoia means to expand your mind, to change your perspective, or to begin walking in a new path. Each week, I hope to help you do just that in regards to how you understand the Christian spiritual path. Through conversations with people who inspire me and sharing my own reflections on theology and my own spiritual journey, I hope to equip and empower you to go deeper in your faith and to follow more closely in the way of Jesus. This podcast is a part of a much broader community of progressive Christians gathered across the internet. We are on TikTok and Facebook and Discord and so many other places, and we have a vibrant community of people going deeper in faith and figuring out new ways of expressing what it means to be a follower of Jesus in our rapidly evolving world. If you'd like to get connected to the Metanoia community, I want to invite you to go over to metanoiacenter.org, and there you can find all the information about everywhere that we're at across the internet, our programs and Bible studies, and how you can get involved. With all of that said, I'm super honored that you've joined me today. Let's dive into today's conversation. Well, hello everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Metanoia podcast. My name is Reverend Brandan Robertson. I'm so glad you're joining us today. And sorry if you're a new regular subscriber and you realized last week we didn't put out any episodes, neither the regular podcast, or the Bible study. And that was because I was actually doing my uncle's funeral last week and just wanted to give myself and my family some time to reflect and mourn. And so I did that. And now we are back at it. So this week, we're going to dive into a conversation that's one of my favorite things to talk about. I always say my two favorite things to talk about are Jesus and sex. And that is really what my career has looked like up to this point. Most of my work has been done talking about re-understanding who Jesus is and what it means to follow Jesus in our modern world, and how we should think about sex and sexuality and sexual ethics. And so one question I get all the time on TikTok, and one of probably the most controversial stances I take, and it's really not controversial at all for most people in the world, but in the evangelical community, it's pretty controversial to take a liberal view on sex and sexual ethics. And so, for instance, I don't necessarily believe that sex outside of marriage is sinful. I don't believe that monogamy necessarily is the only healthy path. And I don't believe that the Bible teaches that either. And so today we're going to dive into this conversation, and I want to explain to you and explore with you a little bit about what a true biblical sexual ethic might look like, what a true Christian sexual ethic might look like, and those are different things, and talk a little bit about evangelical purity culture, because there's been a lot of stuff swirling around in the media about that lately. So we'll dive into that and some more in just a few moments. Welcome back to the Metanoia podcast. So one reason this conversation is so relevant in this moment is if you come from the conservative evangelical community, then you've probably seen that last week the ministry of Ravi Zacharias, who is one of the leading Christian apologists, meaning he's somebody who really built a international ministry teaching conservative Christians how to defend their faith against progressive Christians, against other religions, against atheists. Ravi Zacharias was one of the most respected and frankly, probably one of the more intellectual of the Christian apologists in that world. And again, he had this ministry all around the world. He had a school set up at Oxford University in England. And anyways, he was this evangelical giant. And last week, a report was published by his ministry saying that allegations of sexual abuse throughout the course of his ministry that had been kind of shrugged off and pushed down were in fact true. And they admitted that Ravi Zacharias had a long, long history before he died last year of abusing women, of sexual exploitation, of prostitution. He owned massage parlors, apparently, all around the world, and would make those women think that they needed to do sexual things for him because he was a man of God. Just really horrifying stuff, and stuff that's like almost unbelievable that somebody would actually say the kind of things that are alleged Ravi Zacharias said to women he was exploiting. But of course, it's all true. And this is just one of many, many, many high-profile evangelicals in the past decade that have been found to be engaged in either illegal sexual behavior or sexual behavior that was against everything that they were teaching from the pulpit. And again, I think there's an important distinction there, right? Because some evangelicals, their sexual behavior undoes them because they teach a sexual standard, a sexual ethic that really no one can live up to. And so when they're found not living up perfectly to that sexual ethic, that undoes them. And so from like the outside world, people might look on and say, I can't believe that this is the undoing of this person's career, but I can, because this is the hypocrisy of what they've been preaching and not living. On the other side, there is a lot of sexual abuse within conservative Christianity. And that also, I believe, comes as a direct result of toxic teaching about sexual ethics and what proper sexual behavior is, because a lot of conservative Christian teaching is about repression. And sexual desires are a natural part of who we are. And because they're natural, I would go as far to say they're a reflection of God's own image in us. Humans are fundamentally sexual, and if we're made in the imago Dei, the image and likeness of God, then there must be some aspect of God that reflects our sexuality. So sex and sexuality aren't sinful. They're not broken. They shouldn't be, our natural state towards them should not be repression, but should be exploration, I believe, and celebration. And when you have a theology that tells you not only is it inappropriate to masturbate, not only is it inappropriate to have sex outside of marriage, not only is it inappropriate to do X, Y, and Z, but that God's judgment will be against you if you do that, that's going to cause some unhealthy sexual behavior. And again, that's not an excuse to get any of these high-profile leaders or anyone else off the hook. The fact is, there's a lack of honest, critical thinking in a lot of evangelicalism, right? And a lot of other conservative religions. And because of that lack of critical thinking and the pushing out of facts, of what psychology says, about what doctors say, and choosing to believe ancient ethics and perspectives on things as complex as sexuality, that leads people to act in really harmful ways. And so, as a jumping off point to talk about sexual ethics, I just think always the standard that Jesus taught was that you should know something's truthfulness. You would know something's veracity. You would know if it was aligned with God by the fruit that it produces. And the truth is that for the vast majority of people living under evangelical purity culture sexual ethics, they are reaping unhealthy sexual understandings of themselves and unhealthy sexual behavior. That's a broad statement, I know, but I have spent so much time in conservative evangelicalism, and I've been in these institutions where sex was seen as like the most demonic, evil thing that would undo everyone, and the way that people think about it and the way that people speak about it causes so much shame. Because again, humans are sexual. Sexual thoughts are natural. Being attracted to other people is natural. Having sexual urges is natural. Desiring to fulfill those sexual urges is natural. And yet, so much of Christian theology says those things are evil and need to be shunned, need to be repressed. And so you see, like, I can't tell you how many, like, small group meetings in my Bible college dorm that we had of guys just struggling to say, like, I can't stop, I can't overcome my sexual desires or urges. The point is, you're not supposed to. There's a difference in indulging every sexual impulse, which is obviously unhealthy, but having the impulse and even exploring sexuality, that should be something I believe now where I sit that is encouraged. So, okay, I'm rambling, I'm already off track. Let's give a structured understanding of where I stand on sexual ethics from a progressive Christian perspective. I want to say that I think there is an error on both sides from a Christian perspective when we're thinking about sex. The conservative error is to put a boundary around everything, to repress everything, to demonize sex and sexuality as a whole. The liberal error, which isn't necessarily a progressive Christian error, but I'm talking about like the 60s kind of liberalism, that error was there are no boundaries, everything should be explored, try it all, do it all, whatever you feel generally is good, so do it. Try it. What's the harm? I think both of those are dangerous paths, right? Again, not dangerous in some like divine sense. God's not going to be deeply hurt if you do something sexual that ends up not being the best thing for you. I believe in trial and error. I think that's how humans learn. So there's a side for that. But those both sides are harmful because they fundamentally begin reshaping our minds and how we think about the world and how we think about sex. So if you live in the conservative bubble and all of your thinking about sex is that sex is generally bad, if you're not married to between one man and one woman for one lifetime, there's no proper way to express your sexuality. And maybe if you're a Roman Catholic, you might even believe the only role of sex is for procreation. That kind of repression is going to be harmful. It's just not going to help you live fully and healthily in a psychological way or in a bodily, physical health way, I believe. On the liberal side, living with an embrace of kind of every sexual desire and impulse and having no sense of moderation, no sense of thoughtfulness really towards your sexual expression, just kind of leaning into endless hookups and endless exploration. Usually, that's a sign of also some deeper psychological imbalance. And on that side, usually there are reasons that people feel like they need to lean into sex so fully. Usually it's to numb some pain or trauma. Usually it's to rebel against a conservative past upbringing. Usually it's a way to validate themselves and make themselves feel loved and worthy. And so I feel like on both ends, there are unhealthy repercussions for complete sexual liberation and complete sexual repression. So like in most things, that middle path, that middle way of moderation and the way of exploration coming together, that's where I believe the sweet spot for sex and sexuality is. Sexuality is so complex. We're not just talking about two people getting together, pleasuring one another and being done, or masturbation. Like, it's never just that simple. Sex and sexuality are deeply psychological experiences. They're deeply spiritual experiences. Sexuality is not just something that can be siloed off in any conversation. If we do that, we are not understanding sexuality. It is complex. And so, as we think about sex and sexuality, I think one thing that Christians often have done throughout history that's good is acknowledge the mysterious nature of sex. And even the holy nature of sex. There's something deeply holy and beautiful and profound. And there is something deeply harmful that can come if it is misused. I was writing about sexual ethics in a devotional I wrote, and a friend actually just recently reminded me that I did use a quote that my old Southern Baptist youth pastor gave to me, because it's probably one of the only things he ever said about sex that I agree with to a degree. And it was that he told me, sex is like a fire. And if it's in the fireplace, if it's in its right, proper contexts, it does everything it's supposed to do. It's wonderful. But as soon as it gets out of the fireplace, it has the power to be destructive. Now, some people listening might roll your eyes at that. I understand, because it is a bit of a scare tactic-y kind of language. But I think it's generally true that sex has quote-unquote proper applications. There are ways to healthily express your sexuality. And there are ways to do it that are deeply harmful to you, to others, to society. I think all of those things are true. And so I really think whenever any of us begin thinking about sexuality, we need to push away the desire for black and white answers. We need to push away the desire for certainty. We need to push away the desire for absolute ethics. Like many complex areas of human behavior, the ethics of sexuality from a Christian standpoint are not black and white. We cannot have just a yes or no, in or out, black, white, right or wrong for sexuality. Our ethics need to be highly individualized. You know, my ethic always comes back to, when I'm talking about sex, Romans chapter 14. And I'm going to open up my Bible and read it to you instead of quoting it. Forgive the noise. But Romans 14 is super helpful. It's not itself as a passage talking about sex, but it lays out a general ethic. Paul lays out a general ethic, and he's talking to the early church and really the kind of Gentile believers and the Jewish believers who are coming together and disputing what proper behavior is for followers of Jesus. And Paul writes, let's see. We'll do Romans 14, starting in verse 5. One person considers one day more sacred than another. Another considers every day alike. Each of them should be fully convinced in their own mind. Whoever regards one day as special does so to the Lord. Whoever eats meat does so to the Lord, for they give thanks to God. And whoever abstains does so to the Lord and gives thanks to God. For none of us live to ourselves alone, and none of us die to ourselves alone. If we live for the Lord. If we die for the Lord. So whether we live or die, we belong to the Lord. We'll stop there for a second. Notice Paul's talking about a whole range of different ethics there, right? He's talking about people quarreling over whether to observe holy days or not, whether to eat certain kinds of food or not. These were disputes between Jews and Christians, or Jews and Gentiles, I should say, in the early Christian movement. And he says, listen, stop your arguing. What matters is that you do what you are fully convinced of in your own mind. In other words, Paul is appealing to conscience. Paul seems to have a respect for human conscience. And in the Hebrew Bible, there's a ton of different scriptures that allude to the fact that God has given us a moral compass. And despite whatever your theology might be about sin and the fall, it seems clear that throughout the Hebrew Bible, when these conversations around the law of God written on the hearts of humanity are brought up, the assumption is that sin has not marred that moral compass or has not blurred that law so much that humans cannot tap into it and understand what is right and what is wrong. And here, Paul is saying, our consciences are different. We might be convinced for our life that we should live in this way, but you might be convinced of a different path that you should live, and both paths are legitimate and should be respected. He's saying you can be Jewish and practice all the holy days and eat kosher and be Christian, and the Gentiles should honor you. And Gentiles, you should consider every day as normal and feel free to eat whatever you want, and the Jewish Christians should honor you. Be convinced in your own mind of what is right and what is wrong. This isn't just some lackadaisical, whatever you individually feel is right, do it. Because notice, he also connects it to community. He says, none of us lives or dies on our own. We do it in the Lord. And whenever Paul uses that language of in the Lord, it's usually not disembodied spiritual language. It's usually talking about the body of Christ. Paul is saying you are living in community, Jews and Gentiles. And you're going to disagree about these things? So I'm giving you two ethical rules. One, do what's right in your own conscience, and only what is right in your own conscience. And two, as you do what is right in your own conscience, remember you're living in community with people who might disagree with you. And so he goes on later in Romans 14:13, he says, let us not therefore judge one another anymore, but judge this rather. Let no one place a stumbling block in the way of their brother. He says you can do whatever you need to do, whatever you feel is right to do, but you're in community. So don't let your freedom, your ability as a Gentile to do whatever you want, don't use that freedom in a way that consistently offends your Jewish siblings in the faith. Remember you're a part of a community. So there's this ethic here of personal individual freedom and autonomy and community responsibility and respect. He's saying you're free to do whatever you want and live in such a way that you're not offending others. Now that's a tension. That's not an easy path to walk in, because it's always looking inward and looking around you, looking inward and looking around you. And when we come to something like sex and sexuality, it seems, on one hand, that that's deeply personal, and it is. What you desire sexually, how you feel you should express yourself sexually, that's deeply personal. And one thing the Christian gospel reveals is that we do nothing in a silo. That we are part of not just a body of Christ, but one human family. And the quicker we accept that every behavior we do has an impact on others, every behavior, sexual or otherwise, that changes the way we go about thinking. And especially if you are rooted in a local church community, for instance, your behavior has usually even more direct effects. If you're living in community with people and you're acting in certain ways that are offensive or harmful, that's going to have an impact. So the ethic that I believe Paul is giving the early church for a lot of these matters is personal conscience tied to community responsibility and rooted in the wisdom of Jesus. Personal responsibility, the law of God on your heart, your conscience. Community responsibility, making sure you're not living so lackadaisically that you're harming others and offending others. And, of course, as followers of Jesus, we should use the teachings of Jesus, the values of Jesus, as our center point from which we make all ethical decisions in our life. What's funny is that Jesus doesn't give a lot of very specific laws and rules. In fact, Jesus was the great summarizer. He says, you don't need the law and the prophets. Let me sum them up for you. Love God, love your neighbor. That's it. That's all you need to do. And so the fundamental ethic of Jesus is that. The fundamental message at the heart of all of Jesus' teaching is one of how are you loving God and how are you loving your neighbor and yourself? So if we're thinking about sex and sexual ethics from a Christian perspective, if we're taking a Romans 14 approach, then that means, one more time, I'll summarize it, and then we'll dig in. There is personal conscience, community responsibility, and being rooted in love for God, neighbor, and self. What would a sexual ethic in your life look like if those are the three guiding points? Well, I'm going to give you where I've landed, again, for my sexual ethic. And again, on this topic, this isn't a matter of orthodoxy, and there should necessarily be broad disagreement on this. People should have their own individualized ethics. I do believe for some people, a more conservative sexual ethic is helpful and healthy, because perhaps they're impulsive, or perhaps they have addictive behaviors around sex and sexuality, or perhaps they've had a past of trauma or abuse related to sex, and so their personal ethic looks like non-engagement sexually. There's room for that, of course. And for some people, their sexual ethic might be a little bit more liberated. It might be one that allows them to engage in sexual relationships with people that they aren't in a romantic relationship with. And I think there's room for that too. Now, one of the things people who would critique this position would say is, well, Brandan, you virtually have no support for what you're saying in church history and tradition. You're right. But my argument here is that what Christians have taught about sex and sexuality, especially in the early days of Christianity, their ethic is so harmful and so unscientific and so out of touch that no one, even the most conservative Christians I know, don't adhere to it. Even the sexual ethic of Paul himself, I would say, is not a good one. Remember, Paul writes, if you burn with lust, you should get married. And that was kind of his ethic and the ethic of the early church, that sex was limited to marriage, and marriage itself wasn't a desirable institution. Remember, the early church and even the early patristic fathers believed Jesus was coming back soon. And so, well, if I can abstain for sex for 20 or 30 years, but it means I'm going to be pure for Jesus, great, I can do that. Eventually, they realize that's not happening, and they need to stop living in this apocalyptic mindset. And so ethics begin to evolve a bit, and marriage becomes more permissible in the early Christian movement. But the early Christian posture was that marriage was for weak people. If you got married, it was because you couldn't control your sexual desire and you needed an outlet. And so Paul says only if you can't control your sexual lust should you get married, but everyone else should remain single. That's an ethic I know no evangelical church is teaching. Evangelicals are saying get married as quick as possible so you can have sex. And though it might not be stated like that, as somebody who's been in a Bible college and watched most of my peers get married in their early 20s, talking 21, 22, right out of Bible college, because they couldn't express sexuality except outside of that marriage bond. And then a large number of those marriages end up falling to pieces by the time these people get towards 30, because they didn't have time to actually form a real relationship. They didn't really have life experience. They were going into marriage because of this perverse sexual ethic of evangelicalism. Like, that's not helpful or healthy. There's got to be a better way. And I'm not going to hold up my own life as the paradigm for the best way. I've had both long periods of embracing the evangelical ethic, which I believed was harmful, and I had my swing to the other extreme, and I don't think that is great either, of just kind of sexual free-for-all. So, like, this conversation to me is deeply personal about what does my own understanding of sexual ethics look like? And so I've come up with a couple key points that I do believe are generally universal for Christians. And I'm going to give you these 5 points. And hopefully this is helpful in your own thought process as you think about your sexual ethic. So the first talking point, so to speak, is that sex should be value-driven. but not rule-constrained. So this is using language of bounded sets and centered sets, using the idea of having boundaries versus a core of values that you move out from. Conservative sexual ethics try to put boundaries, try to stop people at certain edges, and usually those boundaries are really restrictive. They're not really based on what's healthy or what's not healthy. They are just kind of arbitrary based on, frankly, misreadings of Scripture. Because, by the way, there's no clear sexual ethic in the Bible. We see people like engaging in polygamy that's blessed. We see people like King David who are murdering people's husbands just so that they can have sex with the husband's wife, and ends up still being called a man after God's own heart. Like, the sexual ethics of the Bible are sketchy at best. And even in the New Testament, like, it's not at all clear that, for instance, sex outside of marriage is sinful. There's actually not a single verse in the entire New Testament that says that. There's a word, a Greek word, porneia, that is mistranslated fornication, which is an Old English word, that did mean sex outside of marriage. But porneia and fornication are not a direct translation. Porneia is a Greek word that is so broad, it was used for all sorts of sexual immorality. And I can tell you that in the Greco-Roman culture of the first century world, porneia didn't refer to sex outside of marriage. The marriage bond, again, in the early church, but also in Greco-Roman society, was not seen as like the foundation stone of society. People weren't dying to get married. So porneia is not premarital sex. And clearly there's also no like condemnations of masturbation. There's no condemnation of a lot of things that are just assumed to be condemned because the Christian tradition has said they're condemned. So I digress. Sex should be value-driven, not rule-constrained. Instead of drawing lines, you can't masturbate. You can't have sexual exploration outside of marriage. Instead, we should center ourselves on a set of values. And I really think, again, the values that apply to my sexual expression are also values that I just want to embrace in my everyday life. What are the values Jesus embodies in general? Unconditional love, self-sacrifice, concern for others, a resistance of not objectifying others. Consent is kind of implicit in the way Jesus behaved. Those things are the values of Jesus, the things that we see reflected in the one that we call God. And therefore, those are the values we should seek to reflect in every area of our life, including sex. So my sexual expression, I try to think of it in that way. Am I centering my decisions here on being like Jesus? Am I caring more about my own sexual gratification right now? Am I objectifying another right now? Or is this sexual experience one that is mutually beneficial, that I'm focusing on another, I'm seeking to pleasure another? I think that's the posture of healthy sexual expression most of the time. Consent is obviously part of healthy sexual expression. I think not being controlled by impulses. That's one of the big ethics of both, again, Greco-Roman philosophy and the New Testament, is that we should be in control of our emotions. We should be in control of our urges. Paul says everything is permissible, but not everything is beneficial. So be not controlled by anything. He says you're allowed, hypothetically, to have sex outside of marriage, but don't make that an excuse to every time you have an urge, every time you find yourself horny, you decide to go have sex. Like, that's not healthy. We need to be in control. We need not to be controlled by our desires, but rather master our desires. It's a very stoic perspective. And I think there's deep wisdom in that. And Jesus embodied that. The Bible also says in the New Testament, use not anger as an excuse to sin. It's the same idea, right? Anger is a strong, powerful emotion, but be in control of it. When you're angry, don't just have an outburst. Channel it correctly. When you are in a period of sexual arousal, channel it correctly. This is a value-centered perspective. It's not clear, then, that there are necessarily black and white, right or wrong rules here. For some people, this might be that their own conscience tells them that they should wait to be in a committed relationship to have sex. And if they go against their conscience, that's sin. However, if you're a person that says, actually, I think I can have healthy sexual engagement outside of the context of a committed relationship in a way that's non-objectifying and non-harmful and deeply consensual and self-sacrificial, then go by what your conscience is leading you to do. Again, it's not a one-size-fit-all ethic. It's a centering on values and living them out in our own lives. The second thing that I've come to the conclusion about, and we've already kind of talked about it, is that there are only two ways, I think, absolutely to have wrong sex, to have sex wrong. One is to do it out of shame. Two is to do it out of pressure. Sex is meant to be a tool for connection, for intimacy, for fun, and for pleasure. But if sex is motivated by shame, or as a result of being pressured to do something you're not comfortable with, then we've crossed a line into deeply unhealthy and dangerous territory. Whenever we're going to engage in sex, we need to make sure that we're in a healthy emotional state. Anything that we do, especially these things that are have deep chemical powers over our bodies. So I would say like sex and drugs and drinking and all of these things, they're not bad in and of themselves, but they are powerful, and we need to be careful with them because they do have the power to be destructive. So if we're moving to do sexual stuff out of shame, we're in unhealthy territory. And of course, if we're feeling pressured like we don't have a choice, that is unhealthy and immoral and often illegal territory. And we should not ever engage in sex that way, nor should we pressure or shame anybody else into having sex. If you're motivated by shame, usually it's because we're either uncomfortable or unpleased with our bodies, or we have this internal value set that has taught us sex is dirty. And therefore, whenever we think about or engage or approach the line of engagement, we feel shame. I think it's important that we do work on and in ourselves before we just go wild with sexual expression. If you grew up in evangelical purity culture or Roman Catholic purity culture, don't just jump into having sex as a reactionary approach. Usually that doesn't help you all that much. Instead, take some time to build up your own worldview. Take some time to really study and explore and find a comfortable place where you actually kind of can articulate what you believe is good for you sexually, and then do it. That doesn't mean that you're not going to have shame at all. I think a lot of inherited belief systems will cause shame, and I'm not saying that that should just be a barrier to ever exploring or expressing yourself sexually, but I do think that reactionary approaches to our conservative sexual ethics from our upbringing can often lead to more pain than liberation. And so shame is just something that needs to be worked on before we really dive into a new posture on sexuality. And again, of course, just to reiterate, anytime we're feeling pressured or anytime we're in a relationship with somebody who's really pushing sex on us and we aren't into it and we don't want it, that is a wrong way to engage sexually. That is non-consensual, that is rape, and a line should be drawn there. So I think those are the two kind of black and white lines for me. Am I being motivated by shame right now, or am I being shamed into having sex right now, or am I being forced into doing something sexual right now? If so, that is wrong. The next point that I've kind of come to is that I believe sex should be destigmatized. It should be a regular conversation. Because here's the truth. Everyone you know is thinking about sex at least once a day. And studies show way more than that for most of us. Sex is an integral part of what it means to be a human being. Being sexual is what it means to be alive and in this world. And as I said at the very beginning, sex obviously must then be a reflection of God's own image at some level, because it is such an integral part, not just of humanity, by the way, but of all of creation. We shouldn't be ashamed of it. We should be talking about it with our friends, with our loved ones, with people we're dating, in churches. We should be talking about sex, especially if we do buy the idea that I'm promoting, that this isn't a black and white thing and that there are a lot of gray areas and personal ethics involved here. It can be really helpful in determining your own values and ethics if you can talk about them and hear and see what other people are doing and what they've come to and how they understand sex and sexuality. In our day, there are so many resources, mostly secular, to learn about sex. There are books by people like my friend Dr. Chris Donahue, or Esther Perel, or TED Talks galore on sex and sexual expression. There are so many resources to help expand our perspective, hello, metanoia, on sex and sexuality. So I would encourage all of us to be doing our own kind of internal conversing and education, but also to take a perspective of nothing's off limits in conversation. Let's get rid of the shame. I really try that with my friends, and even when I'm pastoring folks. Like, we can talk about sex, and not just at some like theoretical level. Like, we can talk about all the aspects of what it looks like to enter into sexual relationships. We can talk about premarital sex or polyamory or open relationships. We can talk about sexual exploration and pornography and masturbation and sex toys and all of those things. They're not some obscure reality off in the distance. These are things all of us are already thinking about regularly. And so we should be talking about them regularly. And the more we do, again, the more we're going to be benefiting, and the more we're going to destigmatize sex, which will help us express it more healthily as a culture. One of the reasons in the past, in particular, that sex often goes underground in unhealthy ways is because it's so shamed on the societal level that you can't do anything but take it, quote unquote, underground. If we can bring conversations about sex and sexuality to the surface and normalize them in the church and in the world, we're all going to have much more healthy sexuality. And as a culture, the way we talk and think and express sex and sexuality is going to be much more helpful. So we've got to move past the awkwardness. And we've got to move into an open and honest place of conversation and story and insights. And my experience is that when you do that, you actually have a lot of fun. Sex is a fun thing to talk about when we get past the shame. It's deeply formative, and it helps tap into pieces of our, I believe, subconscious that can really be liberating on a psychological and spiritual level. The next conclusion I've come to is that experimentation sexually is fun and it's important. I think, like, from a parental standpoint, a lot of Christian parents I've talked to as a pastor are like, I don't know what to tell my kids about sex. I don't want to say all the purity culture stuff that hurt me, but I also don't want to just say, hey, whatever you want, do it. I think one area, though, that parents should be teaching their kids, and we as adults should be embracing for ourselves, is that it's okay to experiment. It's okay to embrace your sexuality, to lean into it, to be playful with your own sexuality, whether that means masturbation, whether that means being in a relationship with somebody and experimenting and exploring and seeing what is good and what's not good, and sometimes making mistakes that teach us a lesson. Hey, I'm not going to go into a relationship looking for that again, or I'm not going to try that sexually again because it wasn't helpful or fun or pleasurable, whatever. The only way you're going to learn these things, you're not going to learn them from conversations. You're not going to learn them from studying. You're going to learn them from doing. Sex is a bodily reality. And so we need to destigmatize experimentation. Kids should not be ashamed to explore their sexuality, and adults should not be ashamed to explore their sexuality. Both are natural parts of what it means to grow up and mature as a human being. And I honestly think one of the reasons so many evangelicals end up having really harmful patterns of sexuality and sexual expression in their 20s and 30s is because they weren't allowed to have free expression and free experimentation and not have shame and stigma heaped on them in their developmental period. I really think that all of us should get to know ourselves personally. And that will help us out when we enter into relationships. And yeah, I just think at that level, God created these desires within us. They're natural, and they shouldn't be demonized or stigmatized. They should be embraced with the values that we talked about earlier of having control over our desires. Experimentation does not mean you can just do whatever you want. That's not going to help you or anyone else. But it's also giving permission to people who feel like they have been constrained and they need to repress and cut off a part of them that is so deeply fundamental. And our sexuality is one of those parts. And I think as I come to the end of this rambling conversation that I hope has been helpful, the last thing that has kind of undergirded everything I've said today is that respect for yourself needs to be at the very core of any sexual expression. Remember, Jesus sums up all of the law and all of the prophets in love God, love your neighbor as you love yourself. At the end of the day, healthy, holy sexual expression comes down to self-respect. If you can move from a place of clarity, from a place where you know your values, you know what you think is right for you, and what you're not willing to do, where you're not willing to go, if you're willing to respect those and not be shamed or pressured to change those, then your sexual expression is going to be deeply gratifying to you. Whether that means waiting until you're in a committed relationship, whether that means engaging in out of committed relationship sexual expression, whether that means being in monogamous relationships or being in open relationships. You need to have self-respect. You need to have clarity of what you believe is right, what you believe is good. And at the same time, you need to heed what Paul says in Romans 14:13. Don't judge others for where they land. There is room, I think, judgment is probably not the right word, but if you see people just living in disrespectful and harmful and abusive sexual ways, yes, there's room for judgment there and calling that out. And if we see people teaching repressive and harmful sexual ethics, I think there's room for calling that out. But beyond those extremes, there's a wide array of postures people can take on sex and sexuality. Many of those are obviously can be rooted in the way of Jesus. Again, people choosing to not engage sexually until they're committed. People who claim the identity of asexual and choose not to engage in sexual expression at all. And people who are open to sexual exploration and expression outside of the context of committed relationships. All of that needs to have room to be respected in our paradigm. But in order to be able to do that well, we need to know where we stand. We need to know what our conscience tells us is right and good and healthy for us. If we move from a place of that clarity, then our own choices will lead us to flourishing, will lead us to pleasure, will lead us to good sex. And when you have that inner confidence and that self-respect, sex really does become holy. It becomes not just a path for connection and relationship, not just a path for pleasure and fun, but actually a path to deepen our own understanding of who we are and our connection to God. There's been so much writing on sex as a path to deep spiritual connection, and we can talk about that some other time because I do believe that's true. But it has to come from this place of health. We have to understand what our fireplace is, to go back to that image at the beginning. We have to understand what are the boundaries that we're setting for ourselves, what are the values we're centering on for ourselves, and be willing to engage others who have differing perspectives with curiosity, with questions, with a destigmatization, there we go, of conversations about sex and sexual expression. So that's my perspective. I hope it's helpful. This is a topic that is, again, one of the most complex psychological, spiritual, physical topics humans can talk about. And so I tried to give it a little structure, and I really do hope it sparked some conversation internally for you. Remember, as always, I love to hear your questions, thoughts, perspectives. So feel free to reach out to me anytime, Brandan at metanoiastrategies.com. And if you have any ideas or questions or want more resources, reach out. And as always, I'll link some good books about this topic in the show notes. So if you want to find some more reading on kind of this perspective I've articulated, I'll put some stuff there. But with that said, I'm so grateful, as always, for you tuning in and listening. And I also want to let you know that coming up in the next couple weeks, we'll get to a interview-based format. This podcast will go back and forth between this kind of teaching and me talking to people I admire and learn from. And so very soon, we'll be having some interviews with some incredible people. So stay tuned. And also this week, the Bible study podcast will be back. We'll be walking through Mark chapter 6, so look for that coming out on Friday morning. With that said, thanks so much. Hey, before I let you go, I just wanted to let you know about an exciting new e-course that I'll be releasing in just a couple weeks. This course is on my book, True Inclusion: Creating Communities of Radical Embrace. And I wrote that book as a practical guide for churches and individuals and companies, really whoever wants to lean into the radically inclusive paradigm of Jesus and begin asking questions. What does it mean to continue to be inclusive beyond becoming LGBT inclusive? Is putting a rainbow flag outside of your church enough? Is showing up to a Black Lives rally enough to actually claim to be truly inclusive? I don't think so. And this book really helps walk you through theoretical and practical ways that you can analyze your community, analyze yourself, find your blind spots, and continue to expand the circle of inclusion to include more and more people. So I really do hope you'll consider signing up to join me on this course. The link is in the show notes, and we'll begin in just a few weeks. So come and join me for True Inclusion: Creating Communities of Radical Embrace, a brand new e-course. Thank you so much for listening in to this week's episode of the Metanoia Podcast. The Metanoia Podcast is a labor of love. Every week, I dedicate time to producing this content to help you expand your faith and go deeper on your journey to follow in the way of Jesus. But this podcast also takes money to run. From the hosting services to the equipment to editing, there's so much that goes into making just one episode of this podcast. However, we have a growing community of patrons on patreon.com that are helping by giving a small amount every month to ensure that this content can go forward. So, if you're able to support this podcast with a small monthly financial gift, I want to encourage you to head over to patreon.com and search Reverend Brandan Robertson. There you'll see a way that you can securely give. And also, depending on the level of giving, there is a ton of really cool perks and swag and coffee mugs and t-shirts and all sorts of stuff. So if you're able to support us, I would be more than grateful. Your support and you listening and sharing this podcast help make this go further and reach more people with the radically inclusive message of God's love. So again, head over to patreon.com. That's patreon.com and search Reverend Brandan Robertson. There you'll see my page and you'll be able to securely sign up and become a regular patron of this podcast. Thanks again, and I look forward to connecting with you next week.